we're just going to give a few more moments for people to enter the room. So if you are here for the event on Palestinian political prisoners, you are in the right place. And we will go ahead and get started in a few moments. Just letting the room fill up. Okay, I think let's go ahead and get started. Good morning or evening for those of you who are overseas. Welcome to today's event, Prisoner Politics, Palestinians in Israeli Jails. I'm Khalid El-Gindi, Director of MEI's program on Palestine and Palestinian Israeli affairs, and I will be moderating today's event. Just a little bit of background before we get started. As most of you know, the dramatic escape of 6 Palestinians from a high security Israeli prison in northern Israel earlier this month has shined a bright light on the many thousands of Palestinian prisoners now being held in Israeli jails, their status in Palestinian society, and their treatment at the hands of Israel. Although all 6 men have since been recaptured by Israeli authorities, their daring escape became a symbol of Palestinian defiance and hope for ordinary Palestinians and leaders alike. For Israelis, on the other hand, most of whom viewed the escapees as little more than terrorists, the incident was seen as an embarrassment for Israel's vaunted security establishment. On the US side, although US officials didn't really weigh in on the subject, the issue of Palestinian prisoners remains the subject of considerable focus, particularly on Capitol Hill. So what are the conditions of Palestinians being held in Israeli jails, and how fair is the process or processes that led them there? What is the political significance of the Palestinian prisoner issue? And why does it generate such intense emotion, whether among Palestinians, Israelis, and even here in Washington? So to shed light on these questions, we've assembled an excellent panel of experts. I'll introduce them briefly here, but you can find their full bios on the landing page for this event on the MEI website, which my colleagues will put in the chat box. First, we have Jawad Boulos, who is a renowned Palestinian human rights lawyer, political commentator, and author. In addition to being deeply involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the struggle for Palestinian human rights for more than 40 years, Jawad has also represented a number of high-profile Palestinian prisoners, including Marwan Barghouti, who is probably the most famous Palestinian prisoner, and others as well. Second, we're delighted to have Sahar Francis, who is the Director General of Damir, Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, a Ramallah-based Palestinian NGO that provides legal and advocacy support to Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli and Palestinian prisons. Last and certainly not least, we have Lara Friedman, who is president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Lara has more than 25 years of experience working in Middle East foreign policy arena, including many years as a foreign service officer with the State Department. Lara is a leading authority on US foreign policy in the Middle East, with a particular expertise on the Israel-Arab conflict, Israeli settlements, Jerusalem, and especially, which we're going to hear from more today, the role of the US Congress. Keep an eye on the chat box for Twitter handles and any other relevant links and articles and resources related to today's discussion. So the format is going to be simple and straightforward, basic moderated Q&A. I will kick things off with some questions of my own. Feel free to pose your own questions at any time during the discussion using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I will try to incorporate as many of those questions as I can throughout the discussion. If you have any technical problems, please don't put those in the Q&A box. You can note them in the chat. Finally, a reminder that today's event is being recorded, so you can always come back and refer to it later. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Sahar, I want to start with you. Your organization of Damir is probably the best known Palestinian organization working on the issue of Palestinian prisoners. Can you give us a sense of the scope of the problem that we're dealing with? How many prisoners are we talking about? Who are they? Is there a preponderance or a trend that, in terms of geography or political faction, are some groups more represented in the prisons than others? And what are the most serious problems that you see facing Palestinian prisoners, especially in terms of their treatment at the hands of Israeli authorities?
So good morning, good evening, and thank you very much, Khalid, for organizing this and inviting me to be part in this panel. Actually, the issue of the Palestinian prisoners tackles every house in Palestine, in the occupied territories. Since the beginning of the occupation till today, the estimation is that more than 800,000 of Palestinians were arrested. You will not find any Palestinian house that at least one member in the family wasn't arrested, even if it's for a short time. Currently, there's more than 4,600 Palestinian prisoners inside the Israeli prisons. Out of them, 520 more or less administrative detainees and 37 women in detention, with 10 parliamentarians, representatives of the Palestinian people are imprisoned inside Israel, with around 200 children that they are arrested in the Israeli prison. The first and violation that we would highlight is the transfer, actually, of all those prisoners from the occupied territories to inside Israel. This is a war crime according to the international law. Israel was supposed to hold these prisoners inside the occupied territories. The torture, ill treatment, and the violation of the rights of the prisoners starts with the first moment of the arrest. Immediately when they raid houses after midnight and they arrest people, they start to torture them and ill-treat them, actually, with the other family members. The torture continues in the way to the detention interrogation centers, and they use mostly stressful tying in very stressful, painful positions, sleep deprivation, solitary confinement the whole time of the interrogation, and like torture is used very systematic in the Israeli in the context of the Palestinian prisoners. 2 years ago, Damir reported several severe cases. One of them, the case of Samer Arbid, that almost died after 48 hours under interrogation in the Russian compound. He was hospitalized with kidney failure and 11 broken ribs out of the torture. And of course, it continues via the different stages of the extension of detention, the charge sheet that would be submitted to the military courts. I wouldn't enter much to the procedures in the military court system because I believe my colleague Jawad will cover it perfectly later on. So the policy of administrative detention that I wanted also to highlight here, the use of the British security regulations in order to impose a kind of detention without any clear evidences against the person, using secret information actually to issue a detention order up to 6 months. And it could be renewed indefinitely, which means you could be held for years without being able to know what exactly you are charged with. And this policy is used against children, against women, adults, against journalists, politicians. Currently, we have at least 2 children under administrative detention. One of them, Amal Nakhli, he's 17 years old with a very serious health condition. So also health condition is a very serious problem inside the prison. And the education, there is restrictions on the ability to continue education. Family visitation is restricted. Lots of collective punishments that the prisoners would face while sitting in the prisons. So I think in the coming questions, maybe we would cover more in details all these conditions that the prisoners face. But of course, this is what push Palestinian prisoners to think all the time, especially because Israel is classifying them and treating them just as terrorists. They could be arrested indefinitely. And this is what pushed them all the time to think about how to be released. Whether even Israel don't respect the exchange deals, the political release of the prisoners. In 2011, after the release of thousands of prisoners, they were rearresting people like Nael Barghouthi, that he already spent 34 years at that time out of the life sentence that he was sentenced for. So I mean, this is what makes Palestinian prisoners try every and each opportunity they have in order to get out for freedom outside of the Israeli prisons.
Thank you, Sahar. Jawed, I wanted to turn to you if I could. As someone who's represented a number of very high-profile prisoners, including Marwan Barghouti and others, you've seen the Israeli system up close. Tell us a little bit about the judicial legal process that Palestinian prisoners are subjected to. We often read the statistic that the Israeli military courts have something like a 99.7% conviction rate, which makes me wonder, well, why do they need to hold people without any evidence or charge if the process itself is so effective, I suppose. In any case, what can you tell us about the Israeli legal and judicial system in terms of due process, basic fairness, guaranteeing, safeguarding the rights of prisoners and so forth? You're muted.
Thank you. No. Is it okay? Thank you, Khalid. Thank you, everybody. Look, asking me after 40 plus years of working in front of military courts about due process and fair trials or etc., for me, it's painful because I thought that this is all settled cases and everybody now knows that these courts cannot be fair trials, cannot deliver fair trials, cannot deliver due process to Palestinian detainees. And it's very simple because going back to the first moment of establishing these courts in 1967, the aim of the courts is to secure this arm, legal arm, as the finishing work of the occupation, as whitening the deeds of the occupier in the end, and enveloping the whole process in so-called legal justice or whatsoever. And it can't be. It can't be from the very first moment. I will maybe not go through the whole addresses of the points where we cannot find this fairness or this process. I may advise everybody who sees us now to go back to several of reports, including of American or European institutions where they have stated down all the things which they have noticed or observed in the courts. Maybe the most recent and condensed and clarifying one is who came from Yesh Din in organization. It's a Jewish Israeli organization where they are taking a major role in observing the works of these courts, and they have put in 2017, I think, 12 some condensed observation where they have named all the aggravations of the Israeli system, legal system, starting from the lack of the presumption of innocence, going with the public trial or the right of counsel in the right way of counseling, delays, rights of minors, etc., prevention of lawyers to visit their clients, etc. All these major rights, which all legal systems in the modern world secured in laws and treaties are not existing in the Israeli field. So I think that it will be useful to go one by one, but I will emphasize more about two major points. I can be a good witness in it since I'm there for 42 years. The difference between the courts I started to work in front in late 70s, starting 80s, I felt the courts as my colleagues, they are military courts as an outcome of military occupation to the Palestinian territories. Now the courts by the year turned their appearance, and they became more as, not as an occupying force, but they are trying to work as courts, as modern courts, with laws, procedures, etc., etc., etc. But it is more like a colonialist organs than occupying organs, and it's a big difference. This means that Israel is really maintaining these courts for long-run terms, and it's a big difference. The moment I entered a court in 1979, from the first step I came in the military camp all over the West Bank. Now we have only 2 military courts, but at the time we had 6, 7 in each direction in the West Bank, occupied West Bank. You felt that you are coming into a military force, a military court with all the protocol of military. Now it's more or less they are trying to have some, I think, misleading cosmetics. This is a very important thing to me. And the second is, what is my role? Not the what is not there in the courts. My role as a lawyer is not exactly the lawyer you understand, Lara, or everybody there. It is completely different. Why I'm still working with no 1% success. My daughter, who is becoming a lawyer now, she asked me, Baba, you've been working there with 100% failure of cases in front of the High Court of Justice, so-called, and or in this, but why you are still working? So I'm trying to explain to everybody that me, at least me, I'm describing 3 layers of help where I can support the Palestinian detainees. The first, you have to understand that the only person who can see the detainee for a long time of detention is the lawyer. And it comes after weeks of detention, because most of the times we are prevented to see our detainees during the interrogation. But still, to see this point of light, me as a lawyer, penetrating the darkness of the cell for the first time, I will infuse my detainee with doses of hope and to bring him back to life. Because at the time, they are trying to convince him that nobody in your nation or in your people take care of you. That's why you are abandoned here. That's why you are neglected here in this cells. So we lawyers are the first psychologists, the first, whatever you want to call us, but not lawyers. We are there. The second, our role is that we were the first witnesses of what Israel is really doing illegal with the detainees. To go back also to history, the first years of the occupation, Israel succeeded to deliver an idea to the world, that this is the most enlightening occupation history has ever known. And it is just doing well with the population until one lawyer called Felicia Langer came in 1974 and wrote the very noisy book at the time, With My Own Eyes, where she as a lawyer described her clients who came out of the darkness with under torture and damages, physical damages, and etc. We continue as lawyers to be the witnesses of history about what Israel is doing or not doing. And the third, here comes the legal aid. But I am not as a lawyer here. I'm more as, let me say, a dealer, a tax dealer, or I'm a dealer who goes to Bundit to release the goods from the harbor. The military courts are the harbors or the airports. The prosecutors are the officers of the taxes. And we are the dealers who go there in order to facilitate the release of the file by negotiating with the prosecution what is the best price to get for our clients. And that's why it comes also why most of the cases, almost 99%, ends with deals, not because also the lack of chances to get a fair trial, which is a major reason for that, but also the price which will pay, our clients will pay in case, and we will challenge the agony of this, the power of the occupier by going to the end of the process will be higher than dealing in order to rescue the lower price.
Thank you, Joad. That's a very powerful statement. So shifting gears a little bit, the issue of Palestinian prisoners also gets a fair amount of attention here in Washington, at least certain aspects of it, particularly on Capitol Hill. So Laura, I'd like to ask you to weigh in particular on the Taylor Force Act of 2018, which basically bars any kind of aid to the PA as long as the PLO or the PA are providing these payments to Palestinian prisoners and or those killed or imprisoned by Israel to their families. I should note that this particular issue of the so-called martyr and prisoner payments is one that has been a PLO policy since 1964, and yet seems only to have become a controversy here in Washington in the last few years. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What is Taylor Force? What does it do? Why this focus on Palestinian prisoners? And why now? But also, if you could, given what we heard about military courts and the sort of inherently flawed and unfair process that's involved, is there a threshold mentioned in the law, in the Taylor Force Act, about those who are convicted in Israeli courts? I know I'm asking for you to pluck some language out of the weeds there, but I seem to recall something about those duly prosecuted or convicted somewhere in the language. But if you could address the Taylor Force Act in general.
Sure, and I sit here very much humbled to be between Sahar and Joad, who are truly the experts in working this on the ground. From Washington, I think looking at the issue of prisoners, it's first important to recognize what Washington doesn't care about and doesn't pay attention to, which is everything that Sahar and Joad were just talking about, right? the issue of the fact that Israel maintains its control over the occupied territories in violation of international law, and that it largely governs by what is called in political science terms, not rule of law, but rule by law. You know, you make the rules, and based on those rules, you can pretty much do what you want. There's very little interest in that. There's very little interest in examining whether or not someone who is duly convicted in Israeli courts, who's a Palestinian who lives under occupation, has gotten any sense of due process. There's very little interest in examining that. There's no interest in examining things like administrative detention, where there's not even a pretense of due process. To be fair, the US, particularly post 9/11, is engaging a lot of that of its own. So, you know, it's not that somehow this is inconsistent with the hypocrisies we see elsewhere. But to the extent that Congress has cared about Palestinian prisoners and administrations have cared about it, and this really, I think it's important to go back very briefly to Oslo, and Sahar talked about this a little bit. You know, the Palestinian prisoners issue is a really important issue for all prisoners, and this came up during the Oslo negotiations. It was one of those issues that dogged negotiators, because for Palestinian negotiators, the legitimacy of any agreement was going to partly be measured on whether or not it dealt with the fact that every Palestinian family has a family member who's imprisoned, virtually. And it wasn't dealt with well under Oslo, but in theory, it was actually dealt with as sort of a pre-final status issue. There were agreements made, and they were weak agreements, and they were agreements that weren't carried out, that in theory resolved the pre-Oslo prisoners, because otherwise the process couldn't have gone forward. What we saw happen, and it really began in Congress around 2013, and it dovetails with the failures of the peace process. It dovetails with the active efforts of the Israeli government, I think, to delegitimize any prospect for peace talks or a partner and all of that during the Obama era and the after the initial Obama efforts around negotiations. You saw Congress seize on this idea of what was immediately called pay to slay. And whoever came up with that framing, you know, I hope they got paid really well, because it's a really effective framing. It rhymes, right? And for Americans coming out of not long ago, the 9/11 experience, as soon as you talk about someone inciting or financing terror, 9/11 in the eyes of US law and in the minds of most Americans erased any distinction between people who commit acts of terror and those who support it and fund it. And what this framing did, and again, this appeared pretty much out of nowhere in Washington in 2013, and escalated, and it showed up in legislation first around efforts in 2014, and then it was legislated in 2015. You basically saw this, or 2018, you saw this language which said, there is no distinction between the Palestinian leadership and terrorists, because terrorists are only acting because they are paid to by Israel. Right? Sorry, by the Palestinian Authority, by the PLO and PA. And therefore, the entire structure of Oslo is now erased. And this wasn't an accident. You know, when in an era of initially trying to erase the actual political gains of Oslo, right? So now settlements we're not going to recognize, you know, any limits on settlements. We're not going to recognize any limits on construction, and we're going to start taking lands and all of that. The fundamental achievement on which Oslo was based was the political legitimization of the Palestinians as a people and the Palestinian leadership. And someone, I don't know who, or a group of people, I don't know whose idea this was, seized upon the idea of looking at Palestinian prisoners and saying, aha, we can use this as the tool to once and for all roll things back to pre-Oslo, to where the Palestinian leadership itself is called a terrorist organization. They're supporting terrorism. They are not kosher. This isn't about a judgment of whether we like their political views. They are not a partner for peace. And that was accomplished with relative ease, frankly. There isn't pushback from Congress. Again, Congress doesn't examine the facts of Palestinian prisoners. They're not interested in whether or not there is actual rule of law, whether people get fair trials. And frankly, there is something very facile and seductive about arguing that if a Palestinian commits an act of terror against Israel, it can only be because they are amoral monsters who do so out of financial, you know, for financial gain. It can't possibly be because they have any grievances. And anyone who would assert that there is a grievance behind any act of terror would obviously be an evil person who's blaming the victim. It's incredibly, it's a very neat tie it up with a bow and now we move on. And with the Taylor Force Act, what you effectively have is a piece of legislation that puts the PA and the PLO in a bind because they're given a black and white choice. Either you betray the Palestinian people who see these prisoners as these are their family members, they see them as political prisoners. I mean, there's an entire, spectrum of what people are in jail for. Many of those people would argue are clearly illegitimate. Some of them, absolutely, this person committed an act. You can call it terror. Someone else might call it something else. But, the PA and PLO has been given a choice of absolutely throwing those people under the bus and saying, we agree with Israel and the United States. You're all terrorists. We're done with you. Or itself being called terrorism, terrorists and supporters of terror. And it's an unwinnable framework, and it's been enormously effective. And I want to just emphasize, it is not first and foremost about cutting off funding to the PA and PLO. The US is forbidden by law, has been for a very long time, from giving any money to PLO. The US for a very long time has given very little, if any, funding in terms of budget support to the PA. This is about delegitimizing the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian people. And it's been enormously effective at doing that politically.
Thanks, Laura. But what's interesting is that it wasn't always this way. I mean, at least there was a moment when the prisoner issue was dealt with a little bit more nuance. I mean, I'm old enough to remember a time when an actual sitting American president was sitting with the families of Palestinian prisoners in the 1990s. And I recall both he and his Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, getting emotional hearing from the children of men who were imprisoned in Israel. And so there was at least an acknowledgement of the humanity of the issue, but there's always been an acknowledgement of the political significance of the prisoners. The US has brokered many of these prisoner release deals, including Secretary Kerry. But it seems like none of that would be possible in today's environment. I mean, I'm asking you to delve deeper than is possible, but what is behind the shift? Is it just someone came along in 2013 and said, this wasn't an issue before, but now it's an issue? Or is there something deeper? Is there an ideological or cultural shift that is happening in American politics that makes this the way it is today?
I mean, I don't have an objectively, I don't have empirical data to bolster my own analysis. My analysis is somebody cynically in the 2013 period seized upon this as a really, really good argument for undermining or wholly destroying the legitimacy of the PLO and PA, because that was what they intended to do. And in so doing, they capitalized on the post 9/11, Iraq war framing. There's good guys, there's bad guys, there's terrorists, and there's victims. And when you're talking about terrorists, motivations don't matter. If you look at the US, I said this to someone who was arguing with me about this a while ago. It's sort of like, if a person with a Muslim name commits some act in the United States, it's absolutely, nobody talks about what were the motivations. Clearly they're terrorists. But if they don't have a Muslim name, then there's suddenly a discussion of, well, what motivated them to, what was going on. That's what we have here, right? You can't talk about what's actually happening in the West Bank. The idea that a Palestinian from a village in the West Bank gets up one day and says, you know what, my family will be richer if I go out and commit an act of terror, knowing that an act of terror is going to result in probably them dying. Maybe they don't care, spending life in jail, maybe they don't care. But it's also going to result in their family home being demolished, so their entire family will suffer. Their brothers and father probably being imprisoned, and imprisoned involves all sorts of physical pressure and other kinds of misery. Their wives, mothers, daughters, whatever, sisters being humiliated. The village facing closure. Travel permits being taken away, work permits taken away. Mass collective punishment will result from this act. It's really dehumanizing in the extreme to suggest that it's only the pecuniary interest of getting this this penchant, right? That's why people do it. But it's really handy because it utterly dehumanizes Palestinians. They are such monsters that they kill Jews for money. And it can't be because anything else is happening, like their villages being, constricted by settlements, and they've just had their home demolished because of lack of a permit, and they've seen their father humiliated growing up at the checkpoints. It can't be about that. And if you say it's about that, now you're excusing terror. It's been an enormously effective way of dehumanizing Palestinians and delegitimizing the Palestinian cause in American politics. And it absolutely does capitalize on the post 9/11 framing or narrative in our country around terrorism, which is fundamentally geared to justify anything we do and to delegitimize and dehumanize anyone who suffers from what we do.
Thanks, Lara. Sahar, I want to come back to the issue of the 6 Palestinian men who escaped and then were recaptured. Immediately after the escape, we saw Israel implementing a number of very extreme measures, transferring prisoners from one place to another, banning family visits, and even arresting the families of those who were the relatives of those who had escaped, apparently to use as leverage. So how prevalent are these practices in general? Obviously, this is a particularly high-profile incident, and escapes are generally rare. But how prevalent are these kinds of tactics that some might call collective punishment? And what is this condition of the 6 men today? I mean, we've seen some pictures of them attending court hearings where they looked sort of having, as though they'd been abused, or, they were in pretty rough shape. What do we know about their condition since they've been recaptured?
Okay, so the issue of collective punishments that the prisoners face while inside prisons is not something new or related just with this case of the 6 prisoners who tried to escape, but or more accurately to free themselves, actually. We should know that prisoners inside the Israeli prisons, they are subjected very often for lots of security raids, security searches, what is called by the prison authority, that is implemented by special security units inside the prison system, that usually in these raids they use lots of force against prisoners, including water pipes, cover shootings in some cases.
And I don't hear Sahar. I'm hearing disconnected.
Yes. I think we had a problem, Sahar, with the audio. I thought it actually was just on my end.
No. I didn't hear any word. It was.
Yeah, there was a lot of interference, I think. Sahar, we didn't catch a lot of what you said. Maybe.
I turned my video off and then.
Okay, let's try that.
Is it better now?
It sounds the same.
Shall I disconnect and reconnect again?
Yeah, why don't you try that? We'll come back to you once you've done that, and then for now, let me turn to Jawad. Obviously the issue of the escapees was, this was a real-time drama that Palestinians and Israelis were following quite closely in real time. And it really captured, I think, the imaginations of a lot of Palestinians. I think it captured the imaginations of Israelis in an entirely different way. But I want to focus specifically on what it meant for the Palestinians. I think 5 of the 6 men were members of Islamic Jihad, which is a relatively small group. I mean, it has a limited following in the West Bank and Gaza, certainly compared to bigger groups like Fatah and Hamas. And yet they were sort of universally seen as heroes, regardless of political faction or ideology. And we know this is in a very polarized and divided environment and moment in Palestinian politics. So why does this issue represent, why does it resonate so strongly with Palestinians? And what would you say to those Israelis who say, who might be sort of horrified at the idea that Palestinians would celebrate people who in some cases, certainly not in all cases, but in some cases may have killed Israelis? So what would the response be to that concern?
Yeah, first, the success of the six to escape one of the most secured, newly systemized jails in Israel is a big, I think, is a big failure technically to those who have felt that their system is impenetrable or undefeatable. So this comes to them in the face and says, no, you are not undefeatable. You are, and it is symbolically, I'm saying that, not only technically. It's very important. And this comes, or this came in a very important moment while amongst Palestinians, hope is disappearing, fading. Frustration is becoming the familiar atmosphere domaining in all villages and streets and towns in Palestine, and more inside the prisons. We know that the Israeli security forces for years are trying to import the cracky situation outside, between the factions of the PLO and Hamas, between inside Fatah itself, etc., trying to implant this situation inside the movement prisoners. And it will be, if they could succeed in that, one of the biggest achievements of the occupation since 1967, because the Palestinian prisoner movement meant from the very beginning to be as outside all the Palestinian internal disputes and struggles. They meant to sustain the real situation between the occupation and the Palestinians. The prisoner movement meant Palestine. The prisoner movement, apart from the organs which compounds this movement, meant hope. The prisoners movement meant the future, the freedom, the moment where Israel could penetrate this movement and fragmentize it to the end. I think they could register a big success. Came this escape try, and 6 of them, 5 Jihad Islami, 1 Fatah, also symbolizes the unity with 2 organizations, but more, gave the prisoners this hope that no jail will be close to the end of their lives, gave the people of Palestine that the hope is still there, freedom is still available. So that those which were infused in the streets of Palestine, Israel could measure that this brought her back years of trying to bring the Palestinian to the opposite movement. Therefore, this action, whether they were recaptured or not, it doesn't mean anything for the moment. The idea to escape and to succeed in escaping, the idea of giving the Palestinians, the fact that they gave the Palestinians, I think the most evaluates the damage of this attempt is Israel itself, and therefore we could hear the anger coming from the Israelis, from the political side and from the security side. They knew that this action made them, harm them painfully. Now, what can I say to that? And it takes me back to what Lara said. Look, the definition of who is a terrorist or not is completely political in our days. So who could debate with the late Prime Minister Shamir that Britain governments called him until the 80s as the biggest terrorist England had known, but yet they had to sit with him as a Prime Minister. Okay, so this is a political issues. You have to remember that the general and the normal situation here, the abnormal situation that the Israelis are occupying Palestinian territories, and there are people who are living under occupation in misery and agony and suffering and etc. etc. And this is the abnormal situation. The normal situation, as all laws, including what had Israelis and Zionists had entitled to do, is to act against occupation. And Palestinians are trying to kick out the occupation from their land. So I cannot convince a right-left Israeli that they are doing the right thing. But I have to explain to you and to Lara, to those who are listening, that this is the normal situation according to the international laws, which are for us is the address how to work and whom and how to judge.
Thanks, Jawad. Sahar, I want to come back to you to give you a chance to finish the point that you were making earlier.
Is it clear now?
Yes,
you
it's
can hear me?
better now.
Okay, so just to add on what Jawad was saying, let's remember that Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist back in the context of South Africa. So exactly, it's a very politicized issue, and I totally agree with what Lara was saying before as well. On the issue of the collective punishments, so I was saying that the Palestinian prisoners are subjected for very systematic ways of punishment inside the prison while sitting in their sentences, starting from raids very often to their own rooms and their sections in the name of security searches, while in these raids, they could be subjected for the use of tear gas, cover bullets, physical force, and in some years, one detainee at least died under these attacks. In 2020 alone, and remember, 2020 was the peak of the coronavirus spread. Still, there were 20 raids reported on the different sections in the different prisons against the prisoners. They would be subjected for family visits cancellation totally, like those from Gaza especially. For several years, they couldn't meet their relatives. They could be punished by house demolitions. They could be punished by restrictions on education, restrictions on getting books and newspapers. The health conditions, as I said, in the last 4 years, more than 4 detainees lost their life because of health neglect policies. And the Israelis would keep their bodies inside the prison and not getting it with the authorities, of course, and not getting it back to the families. Solitary confinement, very high fines that they are pushed to pay for every simple thing that they do, and the prison authority would consider as a violation. And so actually the punishments that the prisoners face is not related directly to the fact that 6 prisoners tried to escape from the prison. All these restrictions that were imposed on the prisoners in the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, in the name of the case of the 6 prisoners, is something that regularly the prisoners face inside the prison. And this is why actually they use the hunger strike as a tool to resist such restrictions. And they were trying this time as well to threaten the prison authority that they will use a hunger strike, but at the end of the day, they canceled this step.
Thanks, Sahar. I want to come back to Jawad on the political significance of the prisoner issue, but before I do, there's a question that we have in the Q&A box that has come up that I wanted to put to Sahar. Can you give us a comparison or a sense, since your organization covers Palestinian prisoners in both Israeli and Palestinian jails. Is there a comparison between the treatment of Palestinians in Palestinian prisons and PA prisons versus those in Israel? Is there, can we draw any generalities, or is there a basis for comparing the two, either in terms of the conditions or in terms of the due process and things like that?
I would answer, but I don't agree with this, like the trying to compare, because I don't think it's a fair comparison between the Palestinian Authority that is acting under the occupation and the sophisticated system that the Israeli state have as a state that they claim that they are the only democracy in the Middle East. Of course, the Palestinian Authority have prisoners. Damir is dealing with those cases of prisoners that they are arrested under the PA for political reasons. So we don't cover regular criminal cases. So I don't gonna talk about the conditions of the criminal prisoners under the PA. But of course, torture is still used for some levels. It's different from the early years of the division between Hamas and Fatah back in 2006, 2007, and the horrible years of the use of severe torture that caused the death of some Palestinian detainees. But still they arrest people for their political affiliation or opinion. And the last, unfortunately this year, we had the case of Nizar Banat, the political activist who was killed while he was, they were trying to arrest him, and the case is still going on in the military court in Ramallah. So there is human rights violations, but don't forget that the PA security service, with all these limitations of the security arrangements that came after the Oslo agreement, they are sub-agents for the Israeli security. And this is one of the reasons, with, of course, other reasons why there is still political imprisonment in the occupied territories by the Palestinian Authority, and the use of torture and the ill treatment of the prisoners.
Thanks, Sahar. Jawad, I want to pick up on the point that you sort of left off in your last intervention in terms of the political dimension. As you noted, I mean, this is the capture or the escape and the recapture of this group of 6 Palestinian men has been a source of real consensus among Palestinians. Picking up on that, is there something more significant to the prisoner issue than just its role as a kind of unifier among Palestinians? Can it actually be can it drive not just Palestinian unity, but can it be an incubator for new political initiatives? I mean, I'm thinking in particular of the prisoner document of 2006, which was at a moment when it was after Hamas's election, but before the split in Gaza, and there was an enormous amount of tension among the 2 dominant Palestinian political factions, Hamas and Fatah. And here was an attempt by prisoners representing the 5 main factions, Hamas, Fatah, Islamic Jihad, PFLP, DFLP, led, I think, by Marwan Barghouti himself, to propose a way out of this internal conflict, to diffuse this before it took a toll on the Palestinian movement, which of course it didn't succeed in doing. We still had the civil war in Gaza in 2007. But I'm wondering if the prisoner issue can play a more prominent political role in that respect as well.
It's a very important, and for me, it's a very painful also issue. The historical normal role of the prisoners all the Palestinian prisoners until the first breaking point started after Oslo. It comes to the second intifada and then to the split of 2006 and then up till now. So the deterioration in the unity of the Palestinian people outside the prisons reflected itself thoroughly to inside the prisons. And instead of acting as a connecting glue, the prisoners, as they have acted from 67, they started to act as mirrors of their organizations, outside organizations. And the split is felt inside the prisons. That's why I said one of the fears of the Israeli security forces, which appears strongly behind the, I knew that because I'm there for 40 years. I felt that they were so afraid that the escape movement will bring back the whole issue of the Palestinian prisoners movement as it is to the front of the Palestinian street affairs. B, that it will push the prisoners inside with this move to reconsider a kind of unity and to start once again to play the play of the maestro of the national rhythm of the Palestinian streets. Therefore, when the Israelis felt that these are the two options may occur immediately, they retreat from there also threats to the prisoners, and they pull back all the measures they were taken. And that's why also the Palestinian prisoners pull back the threat of the strike. So in order to sustain this kind of deterrence situation inside the prison, Israeli pulled back, the prisoners pulled back, and they came back to their places where Hamas is separate from Fatah is separate from others, and Jihad Islami also is still the same. Can they do that as you understand? Theoretically, they have to do it, but can they do it now? I have big doubts because of so many elements. I think that it deprives this situation, it takes its factors from the outside situation. So the question, if Hamas and Fatah can go together outside the prison, we saw that they couldn't, despite all the times they tried to do that. Yes, election, no elections, together, separately, etc., municipalities. But in the end, Hamas Gaza went to their own interests. Fatah went to their own interests, and the situation kept as it is. I think that this situation affects the possibility of the power of the detainees to bring back the document of 2006, which was an excellent solution to the national situation or national unity, but it's a fact it didn't go.
Thank you for that. So we're just about out of time, but I want to come back to Lara on the role of the United States. So while it's obviously true that Congress has tended to view this issue, like so many other issues, through a distinctly Israeli lens, there are some notable exceptions. And I'm thinking in particular of a different piece of legislation proposed by Congresswoman Betty McCollum from Minnesota called Defending the Human Rights of Palestinian Children and Families Living Under Israeli Military Occupation Act. In its original form, as I recall, the bill mainly dealt actually with Palestinian child prisoners as a sort of low-hanging fruit. I mean, who could oppose, who could be for the incarceration of Palestinian children? Turns out Congress has an appetite for that. In any case, the bill has since been broadened, and the process has actually attracted a lot more endorses, including many American Jewish groups. What can you tell us about that particular piece of legislation, its history, and its prospects?
So I want to be pretty brief, just respecting time. I mean, there's good news, bad news here. Like you said, historically, no one's talked about Palestinian prisoners, really their rights, their situation in Congress. It's not for nothing that the only entry point to this conversation is children, because this is, I think there's still very little appetite to talk about rights and treatment of Palestinian prisoners. But when you're talking about minors, I think it becomes something that at least people have to defend themselves when they say why they don't care. Because you're talking about kids that are being held in military courts that have a 99 point whatever percentage, conviction rate, and it's deeply problematic. Kids that are, being interrogated without parents and arrested, from their beds at night and all of that. I mean, the good news is that this bill exists, and it, again, as you said, in its initial form, it was much narrower. It's gotten bigger, and now it's more broadly talking about Palestinian rights, which is great. The bad news, I would argue, is it still has total of 30 co-sponsors out of the entire Congress, all Democrats. And in terms of the prisoner piece of it, it still focuses only on Palestinian children. It speaks more broadly about Palestinian rights. And in the whereas clauses, it talks about things like administrative detention, which is amazing. We've never even heard that countenance, a conversation on that countenance in Congress. But still, I mean, if you use this legislation as a metric, it's not going anywhere and it isn't getting massive numbers of co-sponsors. And B, it's still having to essentially say, well, we're not going to talk about all of the Palestinian prisoners who aren't children, right? We're only going to talk about this subgroup. And I don't think that's bad. I don't think that legitimizes Israel's treatment of Palestinians who are not children. But, it sort of suggests that we still can't touch the broader dehumanization of Palestinians. We can't look at this. And Khaled, I think in your introduction to a previous question, you mentioned it. There was a time in the early era of the quote unquote peace process when the US approach started with, if there's going to be peace, we have to recognize the positions of both peoples. There's going to be incompatible narratives, and it starts with hearing and recognizing and legitimizing these incompatible narratives, right? Which starts with both sides believing that they have justice on their side. And that includes the side that has been fighting to end the occupation, has people in the jails of the occupying party. That seems to be simply impossible still to have that conversation in Washington and have it dealt with by Congress, except when it comes to children. And even when it comes to children, we have now for multiple years seen this legislation introduced, and it continues to go nowhere. And the sponsor of this legislation continues to be, slandered by groups on the right, groups associated with Israel and the government of Israel in some cases, essentially saying that by introducing this legislation and articulating facts that are unquestionably facts, but that have been gathered by groups that they consider anti-Israel, that she is aligning herself with terrorists. So I very much a good news, bad news scenario.
Thanks, Lara. So unfortunately, we're out of time. We could go on for another several hours, I'm sure, but I want to thank our excellent panelists, Lara Friedman, Jawad Boulos, and Sahar Francis. And thank you all for joining us. Thanks to our panelists again for making this such an excellent and really rich, informative conversation. A reminder that this event is being recorded, and a recording will be posted shortly after we wrap up. Thank you again, and hope to see you at our next Palestine program event.